Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our second session of How Lakes Work. I'm John Miller, president of Muskoka Steamships and Discovery Center, and it's my pleasure to join you tonight as we explore one of Muskoka's greatest treasures, our lakes. This three-part webinar series, presented in partnership with the Friends of the Muskoka Watershed, brings together outstanding scientists and stewards of the environment to help us understand how our lakes function and how climate change is reshaping them. Together, we'll learn not only about the physics and biology beneath the surface, but also about the cultural and ecological significance these waters hold for all who live, work, and play in Muskoka. I'd also like to say a little bit about our relationship with Friends of Muskoka Watershed. This organization is made up of amazing volunteers committed to educational, environmental outreach. We at Muskoka Discovery Center have worked with them for over 10 years now on various projects, exhibits, and cruises. And this will be our third webinar together with a total of 14 episodes and over 3,000 views on our YouTube channel. We value this partnership and recognize all the work they do to inspire us all to protect and enhance Muskoka. Now on to the webinar. So throughout this webinar tonight, we encourage you, our audience, to post questions in the Q&A while the presenters are presenting, and we'll read them to the presenters at 8:30 tonight when both are finished. If your question's already been posted, then click like, and the question will be moved higher in priority. We can't answer all the questions in the time we have, so if we don't get to yours, please email us on the address that we post in the chat, and we'll work on getting the answers to you. This webinar is recorded and will be posted on our website in a few days' time. Thank you for being here and for your ongoing commitment to protecting the lakes that define our region and sustain our way of life. I'm delighted to introduce Lenore Innes for our land acknowledgement. Enjoy the webinar.
Great, thank you, John. Hi, I'm Lenore Innes, Chair of Friends of the Muskoka Watershed. Before we begin, we acknowledge that we're gathered on the traditional and treaty territory of the Anishinaabe, including the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples, and of the Wata Mohawks. These lands are covered by Treaty 18 and the Williams Treaties. Tonight's conversation is about lakes, how they work, and how we care for them. We recognize that Indigenous peoples have cared for these waters since time immemorial, with deep knowledge rooted in relationship, responsibility, and place. We also recognize that organizations like ours have benefited from systems that historically privileged settlers and institutions in access to land, resources, and decision-making, often to the exclusion of Indigenous communities. We commit to approaching this work with humility, to keep learning, and to support stewardship that makes space for Indigenous knowledge, sovereignty, and leadership. We invite everyone here to reflect on what protecting Muskoka can look like when these principles are centered. On the last episode of How Lakes Worked, we explored some big picture lake health. Tonight, we're zooming in on the zones and creatures that act as the vital pulse of our waters. We have two incredible experts to guide us through this hidden world. First, I'm pleased to introduce Gord Miller of Earthroots. Gord is an ecologist and is also the former Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, where he served as the province's independent environmental watchdog. Gord also happens to be a wonderful speaker, and tonight he will take us to the water's edge with the Littoral Zone, lots of action at the lake's rim. He will introduce the Littoral Zone by walking through the four big questions: what it includes, how it functions ecologically, why it matters to the whole lake ecosystem, and how human interaction with the shoreline shapes lake health. Most of us think of the shoreline as where we swim or launch a boat. Gord is going to give us a clearer way to see it, and a shared vocabulary we can use to understand what's happening at the lake's rim and why the choices we make there matter. Following Gord, we're honored to have Dr. Norman Yan. Norm has spent over half a century protecting Ontario's lakes, first with the provincial government, then with York University, and eventually as the founder of Friends of the Muskoka Watershed. His lifelong dedication was recognized in 2012 with his induction as a Fellow into the Royal Society of Canada. Today, Norm is here to tell a love story, specifically for the love of Daphnia, how tiny creatures make our lakes work. He's going to introduce us to the little living lawnmowers of our lakes, animal plankton. You'll meet the water flea Daphnia. She's only 1 millimeter long, but she swims the equivalent of a marathon every day, and along with her kin, filters the entire volume of a lake every week or two to keep our waters clear. Norm will show us why, if we want to protect our lakes, we have to start by loving the tiny creatures that keep them alive. I'll hand it over to you now, Gord.
There I am. Thank you. Welcome. Thank you, Lenore. Thank you, John. And my name is Gord Miller, as Lenore indicated, and I'm an ecologist. I'm going to talk to you about the littoral zone of the waters. And what is the littoral zone? Let's talk about that to start with. So first of all, as an ecologist, ecologists talk about the structure and function of ecosystems, and the littoral is overwhelmingly about structure. But let's just recap a little bit of function and other parts of what happens in the open water. But it's called the schematic behind me. It's called the limnetic zone, which or some people call it pelagic zone, which is the open water zone of the lake. And the open water part of the lake, the big, large part of the lake, the light comes down. That's the source of energy for the lake. And as Norm will explain, there's tiny plants floating around in that shallow water, in that sunlit area. Those are phytoplankton, and phytoplankton are capture with photosynthesis the energy of the sun and fix it into sugars and other organic matter that can be passed to the next level, the trophic level, which are the zooplankton, which Norm will tell you a lot about. And below them, the zooplankton, larger zooplankton, and fish, and so on, up the food. The energy captured by those phytoplankton in the upper layers are passed down till through the ecosystem to the large final predators. Now, the fish are what we know is large top of the trophic system in the lake, but not really, because humans catch fish, eagles take fish out of the lake. So there is some energy transfer after that. But that's not what we're interested in. What we're interested in is not that open water, that's fine, but what happens when this light comes down, this light lit zone, and it hits the bottom, the substrate, the solid. The game changes completely when the light hits the bottom. That's the start at the deep end anyway. That's the start of the littoral zone. And why is it different? Well, unlike the limnetic zone, where things are floating around and catching light and things, all of a sudden in a littoral zone, we have a bottom, and we can have plants that can have roots and stay where they are and fix themselves to the surface. And there's also another surface involved. There's a water surface up here. And the plants can grow up and float some special leaves and take advantage of the high light that's out in the atmosphere. So there are conditions of structurally changed in the littoral zone. Now, things are changing at the bottom too, because there is a substrate, something for plants to become anchored to, but as well, that substrate with wave action and something called longshore drift. Have you ever seen at the cottage that if you have a bit of a beach, it begins to move and shift sometimes over the years? Well, that's longshore drift. That's the action of the waves in the lake moving the actual substrate of the lake. And of course, that's hard on plants, and because it's mechanical movement and abrasion. So the environment of the littoral zone has its bottom, it has plants, and it has a surface, and the bottom moves. So it's a completely different environment than a deeper in water in the limnetic zone. Now, so for a definition, the littoral zone, let's define it the other way, it starts at the surface, starts at the shoreline, high water mark, and it proceeds out through the depths until the last point where the sun or the light that coming into the system sometimes contacts the sediment. Okay, not all the time, just sometimes. So that's littoral, is different than the limnetic zone of the lake in the deeper part. Well, so what are the parts? Well, I've already talked a little bit about the big creatures that people recognize occupy the littoral zone. That's the aquatic plants. Now, there's basically two types. If Norm loves zooplankton, Daphnia in particular, I love macrophytes. Macrophytes are the group of aquatic plants that occupy the littoral zone. Some are rooted, they're vascular. Vascular means like they came from land plants, so they nominally they can move material up and down through their stems like a tree or a land plant. But some are algae, some are macroalgae, not the kind of floating algae we see out there, big algae, and they only transfer the fluids between cell to cell, so they're not vascular. But between aquatic vascular plants and macroalgae, those are the macrophytes, which give structure and form to the littoral zone, and they fix a lot, as we'll find out, not all of it, but they fix a lot of the energy. So the plants you see there, you'll see them holding their leaves up like a land plant, and catching the light and such things. How do they do that? Because in the land, you pull the weeds off, pick them up, tear them out of the soil, and of course they have strong fibers in them that hold them up. If you leave them out in the sun long enough, they wilt because they use hydraulic pressure of the water in them to keep their form above the land. But aquatic plants, macrophytes, are not like that. Macrophytes are pneumatic. They hold their form and they have their strength. They don't have strong fibers in them. If you ever grab one out of the water, you'll find it just goes whoop, because it's pneumatic. It inflates this tissues in order to hold it up in place. And then it has within it specialized spaces called lacunae, and it emits the gases. Instead of land plants, as you know, in photosynthesis, you've probably heard that land plants, the sun hits them, they produce photosynthesis, they produce oxygen and releases the atmosphere. And by the way, all plants and all animals breathe, so they also breathe and they release carbon dioxide. Well, on the land, that just goes off of the atmosphere, but in the water, these macrophytes can move that gas into their own tissues and produce flotation. And so their macrophytes are pneumatic, which is something unusual. And in fact, now there's a specialized case right at that surface, because, well, okay, we can have floating things, but when we get to the surface is a rough place. There's wind and wave action that wants to, so if you have leaves up there, that they want to be torn by that wind and that wave action. They want to be drenched by the rain that falls and submerged and driven down. So to take advantage of the surface, especially if you have frogs up and around and that sort of thing, you have to have specialized leaves. And the floating leaves have special characteristics. Their top is waterproof, so they won't sink in the rain. There are lots of flotation in them to keep up and hold those frogs and other things that land on the aquatic floating leaves. And their shape has to be such to resist the tearing action of the wind. Have you ever seen a lake? You'll notice this, how the floating leaves of aquatic plants get flipped up in the high winds and such, and it's a rough business. And the best shape, the physics of such, a best shape for a floating leaf plant is circular. So they tend to evolve their floating leaves to a circular shape. Now, few of them are truly circular. There are some, but most of them are evolving that way. So they end up being oblong or some shape to them, because those shapes are stabler in high winds in that surface environment. Of course, closer to land, you have emergent plants, and they're a little bit more typical. They look like land plants. They can have floating leaves, some of them, and leaves that are up in the air. And they have fibers in them like land plants, but they must be rooted in water. That's why they're macrophytes. So they're sedges and some grasses and rushes. These are all kinds of words that associate with plants that are sedges, rushes, and grasses, and that are emergents in these lakes. But that's not the only physical structure that's in these lakes. There's also woody debris. Now, in the most visual form of this woody debris is when like a beaver cuts down the wind cut down a tree, and the tree caves down into the shallows of your lake. So that obviously is a lot of woody material that's in the lake, and it gives physical structure to the lake. And that physical structure of all that wood and debris and branches and things, as well as the macrophytes themselves, as well as the bottom material, is covered by something else, something like the technical name for it from most of us is slime, because they're kind of slimy when you touch them. But what the real technical name is periphyton. That's a whole ecosystem in itself. It's a collection of microorganisms, algae, debris that form like a coating over the entire surfaces, all these tremendous surfaces that occur in the littoral. So all the surfaces are covered. Now, there's all sorts of creatures I'm sorry, my phone is distracting me. All sorts of creatures that live in this periphyton and thing, and some things you'll recognize, some things you'll be able to see. Many of them are pretty tiny and pretty small. But I'm sure many people have seen snails, and snails cruising along through the slime on branches and twigs and things, and just seemingly scraping and eating and they're eating everything. They're just cruising along. So snails are something that we recognize that lives in the periphyton. But as well, though, if you're a snorkeler and you go and swing in the water with a mask and snorkel, you'll see look up closely, you'll see tiny creatures like hydra, as one of the you regularly see. Hydra are little tiny creatures that adhere in one end to the periphyton, and they have little tiny narrow tubular bodies and tentacles with nematocysts that wave in the air and looking for prey. And when something comes in close, they nail the prey with their nematocysts and sting it, and they die and they pull it in. And so they're kind of a neat creature. They're like sea anemones. They're actually related to sea anemones, but they're quite common in our lakes if you look closely, and perhaps you will. So there's other things, of course, that live in the benthic deposits in the bottom of the lake. There's just all sorts of a range of things, including insect larvae and crustaceans and little of all sorts of little kinds of creatures, even earthworms, or they look like earthworms. They're aquatic forms, they're aquatic species, but they look like earthworms and that sort of thing. So the bottom of the littoral is alive with thousands of creatures. But there is something else in the Muskoka Lakes. You see it predominantly in the cleanest of areas, in the softest, purest water lakes. Not all of them, but many of them. And in fact, the clear, you get a lake like Skeleton Lake, for instance, in Muskoka, which is ultra pure. You get the only you don't see plant communities, you don't see tall communities, you don't see much in the way of floating leaves. What you see is almost like a turf, a grass-like lower species forming a turf along the bottom that looks like a lawn. And we call those isoetid mats. There's something unique to very clean oligotrophic lakes like Muskoka. And isoetid is named after Isoetes, the plant, one of the plants that has this little form that grows very low and very close to the bottom. There's a reason why they occupy these spaces. But the isoetid mats are quite unique. They're very good for the lake. There's nothing wrong with them. They're not a very obtrusive, but they are very sensitive. So what you find is these isoetid, you may have encountered this if you're a Muskoka person and going around, and you'll find if you step on them, you tend to break through. And if they're in a lot of swimming areas or a lot of boating areas, they've been broken up, stepped on, crunched, and then the wave action tears them apart. So they're not very resilient to disturbance, but they're quite unique. Isoetid mats are quite unique to these oligotrophic lakes in Muskoka. So how do they function ecologically? Well, remember, ecology is about structure and function. Well, one of the main functions is energy flow, and that's a really interesting part of the littoral zone. Something that you have to be very aware of that. Let's start. The simplest case is that the light coming in, we see here, just like in the limnetic zone, the light coming in is captured by plants and fixed, and that's in this case in littoral, it's mainly macrophytes that capture it, but they form sugars and other molecular organics material, which is the food stuff, the thing that keeps the system going. And the littoral, though, is far more efficient than the limnetic, because the limnetic, you finish just light comes down, goes through the water. Some of it's intercepted by the plankton, but much of the light is not, and it just passes down. The water molecules diminish it as it goes down into the darkness. But in the littoral, because the light will hit the bottom, it is reflecting. And even all these surfaces, the surfaces are all covered by periphyton. And periphyton has Part of its membership is algae species. So the macrophytes fix energy, the periphyton, the algae and the periphyton fix energy. The light is trapped in that it's reflective and coming back up rather than in the open water as well. And probably more important in this respect is that in the open water, trouble is that phytoplankton catch some photons of light and produce some sugars and such things, and then are washed away. They float away. In the littoral, the material is not lost. It's generally trapped by either rooted macrophytes, or if not, it settles. It settles just a short distance to the bottom. It doesn't disappear down to 40 and 50 meters down to the bottom. If it's material or dead material or such thing, it'll just go a shallow distance and hit the bottom, and still available for living creatures. So energetically, the littoral zone is very favorable. It traps a lot of the energy, the sun's energy, much more so than the outer lake waters magnetic zone. So, being a science guy, you got to have some big words. So I'm going to teach you some big words that I relate to this section. So when we talk about organic matter that's produced from energy trapped from within the lake, we call that, use the word auto, like auto being singular or one, autochthonous. So it's an autochthonous source of energy and trapped in your autochthonous organic matter. Isn't that a wonderful word? That's wait do you hear the mate to it? So energy coming into littoral fixes autochthonous organic matter, and that's the result of the energy flowing in. But that's not, and this is key. This is key if you want to understand the littoral. There's another source of organic matter, which is a source of energy. It's a major source. And before I explain it in detail, let me make you think about if you have any big maple trees on your lawn of your home, and in the fall, in September, when the leaves come down, you have to spend a weekend raking up leaves. And if it's a big mature maple, you've got bags and bags and bags of leaves put out for the town to take away. All that organic matter represents as fixed sunlight that produced organic matter. Now picture that tree or those trees right along the shore of a lake, right near a shore of a lake. All those leaves come down. Where do they go? They go in the lake. So there's a tremendous amount of organic matter that comes off the land. Leaves being a big one, but not just leaves, sticks, weed seeds, cones from the pine trees, all matter of organic matter rains down. Picture if you've got a lakefront cottage, and check your roof out, and you'll be very aware of how much rains down from the forest around you. All that goes in and is either directly falls in or is washed into the littoral zone, and it represents a huge amount of energy because it can then be used by the living things in the water, and we call that stuff allochthonous. So remember, autochthonous is generated internally. That's auto-generated. That's autochthonous. And allochthonous is all this tremendous amount of energy that comes in from outside. And if you don't think it, just to put it in perspective, one thing to make it understandable is think out in the limnetic zone. These algae, they're so sparse you can't even see them readily without a microscope and are collecting them. So they're only a few grams, or the amount of energy and organic matter fixed by the algae in the limnetic zone is measured in grams per square meter. But picture in the littoral zone, when the big maple trees are on the shore, kilograms and kilograms and kilograms of organic matter get washed into the system. And of course, that supports a whole new system of life forms, because there's creatures that exist only to chew that stuff and shred those leaves up and all that woody debris and matter and produce it, and they create a whole new ecosystem, littoral zone, fed from the land. And that's where you get all sorts of insect larvae carving up the leaves. You get larger crustaceans like crayfish. You get the turtles live there. They don't necessarily eat that organic matter, but they'll eat the creatures and they eat anything that's available. It's in our meat, but you get all those insect larvae feed little fishes, and sometimes there's a special species of fishes that are only found in those narrow littoral zones. And then you get Mother Merganser go by with her, 15 or 18 little babies cruising the shoreline. We've all seen that in the Muskoka lakes. They're picking off little fish and things that they can find, and being fed from the land, as well as we got a tremendous number of small creatures that are there in these waters. So the other aspect of function in the littoral zone is to do with the nutrient cycling. And again, it's a parallel situation. Out in lakes, as you've heard, I'm sure Neil, when he talked last week, he talked about in the open water, he talked about dissolved nutrients and phosphorus and that sort of thing. It's very important. And the amount of life and production that can occur in the open water is limited by the available amount of nutrients that are dissolved in the water and available. Not so much in the littoral zone, because all of this breaking down organic matter and is creating available nutrients that didn't come from the aquatic system. They came from the land in the form of organic matter, and they are trapped once they get in the functioning system of littoral, where the plants grow and die and fall on the bottom, and the animals are there to consume them, shred them, and deal them up, and they capture the nutrients much more effectively than the open water. So the nutrient dynamics of the littoral zone is really important. It feeds itself. It keeps itself healthy by feeding itself. And that's where you get creatures like, you get creatures like caddisflies, and these are insect larvae and stone flies and things that chew up these things, and they in turn feed other larger animals, as we indicated, and it closes the nutrient cycle and traps them in. And that's where you get, we get loons and things like that coming in and feeding on things. So how important is the littoral zone to the whole lake? So we know it fixes a lot of energy, traps a lot of energy, it closes the nutrients. Well, it's then we get into another technical word, and it provides a lot of what we call, ecologists call, spatial heterogeneity, which means complexity of space. It means places to hide, places of refuge, for instance. If you want to get some meaning behind this. So when there's structure, physical structure, then things can hide. So if you're a snorkeler, again, a swimmer, even, if you're swimming around the shores of the Muskoka Lake, you'll find there's not a lot of visible activity often just in the regular areas, until you come to some place where a beaver has collapsed a tree and there's a bunch of branches and things trapped in the thing, or maybe a beaver's put a food pile in there and there's branches associated with that. But there's spatial heterogeneity, and you look in there and it's full of minnows and things that you can see, living things, aside from covered in periphyte and all the rest of it. There's things hiding in there, hiding from predation, from those mergansers, from those loons, but also look over there, that old log or that big stump, and what's lurking in the shadows? Well, there's a big bass there, or some predatory fish hiding, looking for one of those minnows that is sought refuge in the spatial heterogeneity of the woody debris, to make a mistake and come out, and boom, when you get a chance to one mistake. So that's the kind of thing that occurs, and that's really important for the lake as a whole, to have that kind of structure and have those kind of hiding places and have that thing. As well, we shouldn't discount the effect of, I mentioned beavers, but think about the interaction with the near shore, the dry near shore. You've got, those beavers, they build houses on the shore, they cut trees and they haul the trees in. So there's tremendous interaction there. I mentioned turtles. Turtles who live there, they require shorelines. They require beaches, or preferably a slope of sand, in order to go and crawl up in the spring and dig a hole and lay their eggs. So turtles require shorelines and occupy and make their living in the littoral. Other things require those shorelines too, like say the great blue herons wading in the shores, or the piping plovers and the shorebirds skittering around on the sand, and things that poking up for little bits of gum, things you can't even see, but they're gleefully sitting and nibbling and things. But interface with the shoreline is a very important part of the littoral zone. And I've mentioned frogs, and birds like phoebes, flycatchers. If you watch the shore and watch where the branches of the trees lean out over the shoreline, and you'll find that these flycatchers utilize those, and they'll be sitting there and they'll zoom out above the aquatic plants, the emergence, and zinc it, get a nail of some kind of emerging damselfly or something, and boom, back and hide in the tree again. So the interaction of the shoreline is very, very important. But something maybe that is not as known as it's well known to fishermen, is that the importance of littoral to the fishing zone, fishermen, the fishing populations. When you go in the spring, and even you'll see this in Muskoka lakes, you can see, especially if you have a sandier or open bottom, you'll see circles that have been apparently sort of cleaned out. Well, those are fish nests. And if you watch them, when they're in the shallow water, you can see them from the shore or from the dock. And they're circular, they're maybe, that big around, and sometimes a little bigger. And in the middle, what the male fish create those nests with fanning the bottom, create a nest, drag the female in there, and female lays some eggs, the male fertilizes the eggs, and then the male stays on that nest. If it's a bat, we're talking bass and some fish, but the commercial fishing species that most people are interested in is smallmouth bass. The male bass will sit on those nests or stay in those nests, drive off all intruders, and guard those little baby fry that emerge until they're big enough to fend for themselves. And during that time, by the way, the male bass doesn't go hunting or doesn't eat, it just guards that nest until the fry are large enough to get away. So obviously those shorelines, those sandy or very, very small gravel rock shorelines, are essential to have sustained populations of smallmouth bass. We don't get largemouth bass up this far north. But they're the same in the south. Other fish we know also use the littoral, but use it differently. So, for instance, northern pike. Some people fish northern pike. It can be quite large. They utilize they don't build nests. They come in just after ice out, just very early in the spring, and they utilize the emergent macrophytes, the ones that we see here. They use the residual emergent material and they attach their eggs to them. They actually come right into the shells and attach their eggs to the plants, and the fry hatch and hide in the refuge and the spatial heterogeneity provided by initially by the plant residues, but also eventually get a little further and hide further. And then of course they become ambushers, and as they grow and be predators themselves. But people fish pickerel, walleye, pickerel. I'm from north, so they're pickerel to me. And pickerel utilize, although they will love to have rivers and streams and gravels, high oxygen environments to spawn into. They also will spawn in the littoral if there's rocky substrate. The rocky substrate of littoral is good spawning turf for pickerel, as is a coarser material that coarse shoals, but again, the littoral area of coarse rock, very specific sizes, by the way, are necessary for lake trout to spawn. Lake trout are very fussy about their spawning locations, and they're usually just a few very specific locations in a lake, but they are in the littoral zone. The lake trout, when they spawn, you can see them. If you're in a boat above them, you have to be out in October at midnight with a big light, as I've done with biologists. But they're there, and they're in the shallow water, 3 feet of water, meter of water. So the zones are critically important to the stage of life for many of the species that we value, whether just to experience, like loons or great blue herons, I think, or to fish that we, recreationally fish and eat. And so it's critical. The one particular zone, it's not the big open water is good. It's good to have. Certainly those lake trout go into that big open water and end up gobbling up other things to get big and fat and prime for catching. But that's but it's important to know that that's what those zones are best for, the productivity of the critical life stages of things like the fish that we value so much in our lives. So what about human interaction with the littoral zone? How do we tie the people into what's happening on the littoral zone? Well, unfortunately, I talk about spatial heterogeneity. I talk about allochthonous organic matter, the leaves coming in. Well, what do people tend to do? People tend to see, well, that's kind of messy, isn't it? That's messy. It's not neat. It's not smooth. I'd rather have my lawn mowed grass down to the water's edge. Isn't that nice? That looks really nice. It's like, not so nice ecologically. Not so nice from the lake's perspective, from people out on the lake. Maybe like nice to you, but is that what you want to do? Is that what you want to sustain? Given the value of that littoral zone in front of your place to the whole ecological functioning of the lake, do we want to be more aware? Do we want to not have to remove so much woody debris, not have to tear out the aquatic plants? I mean, how much room do we need for swimming and things? And by the way, things like docks and swim rafts and boathouses, the traditional boathouses, not some of the ones we built in Muskoka, but with open water basins, they can be good. They can be positives. They can be good habitat, good structure, good spatial heterogeneity, good hiding places, good refugia. So docks and boathouses and swim rafts can be good things in the littoral because they create complexity for the creatures that utilize it. But how much space do we actually need? Well, most lots, aquatic lots, waterfront lots are about 100 feet. If I can work in meters, that's about 30 meters. So you got 30 meters that you own, and then you got a neighbor on either side. How much you actually see? Well, they've done research on this. And you know what? For just a swimming area for the kids to play in and things, and you're worried about what they step on and what they kind of, all you need is about 10 feet wide, 3 feet wide. If you want to clean out the debris, you want to think just 10 feet out, 10 feet wide, and 6 feet out, because you don't need to clear it out after 6 feet because people aren't touching the bottom after 6 feet. If they're actually swimming, they have to be actually swimming by the time you get, well, the occasional person is that tall, but most people aren't. And most people are already swimming by 6 feet of water. So 3 feet, 3 meters wide, 2 meters deep is a good swim recreational area. And if you add in, say, another 3 meters for a dock, and then maybe 3 meters for a boathouse, you're still only what, 30 meters or so? I'm sorry, 15 meters or so. You're still a small percentage of that 30-meter wide lot that you have, and that's how you should look at your waterfront. If you feel the urge to make it neat or orderly, keep it small, keep it within your needs, and then you can have the area on one side adjacent to your neighbor that's all natural, and you can have the area on the other side of that use area all natural. And so on the lake, only about a third or less of the lake is actually disturbed, and all big chunks with your neighbor, you get a big chunk of healthy littoral that's still producing fish and providing habitat for wildlife and having those natural ecological conditions. So that's how you can live on a lake and have the minimal impact on the littoral. I hope maybe you've learned a little bit about what the littoral is and how important it is to the lake. And I hope you got a couple of big words out of it, like allochthonous, autochthonous, and spatial heterogeneity, because it's always good to propagate the business of ecology to the greater masses if you can. So with that insight into the fringe of the lake, the littoral, I got to hand this off to Norman Jan. He's going to talk about what happens in the limnetic mining. Thank you.
Thanks, Gord. Wonderful introduction. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So let's turn the bows of our boats and swim offshore now and see what's out there in the open water. I had a problem in trying to prepare this talk because there's tens of thousands of scientific articles on this topic. And dozens of textbooks, and obviously we can't cover it all. So what I'll do instead is pick one animal. I could have picked any animal, they're all spectacular, but I'll pick the one I know best, this cute little water flea called Daphnia. First thing to tell you is that they're not a flea. They were called water fleas because of their jerky motion and because they have kind of a flattened carapace. And that made somebody think they looked like fleas. I'll use this little water flea as an example of how legs function. I could have picked any animal off there, they're all wonderful, but I'll pick water fleas. And let's start though with something that Gord mentioned, that the offshore, at least on the surface, looks a lot simpler than the inshore. It actually is. And there are quite a few challenges to live out there. And I've listed some of them here. First thing is there's essentially no gravity. So um, if you can just essentially swim. We all know that. If you have some heavy body parts, if you have a little bit of oil or a little bit of air, then you are essentially free of gravity. But one challenge, unlike the littoral that Gord talked about, is there's no solid footing. So if you're an animal, there's nothing to push against for locomotion. If you're a plant, there's nothing to root in. And so you have to find some other way to stay, if you're a plant, in the lighted zone, because as Gord mentioned, and as Neil mentioned last week, the light declines with depth. It's a high viscosity environment, um, about 100 times more drag than in the air. So you can move by pushing against the water, but it really helps to be streamlined. Neil mentioned last week that temperature doesn't vary that much, and that's true. It never gets less than zero, unlike today, when it's minus 15 out in the air. So you can be cold-blooded. A lot of the animals that live offshore are cold-blooded, and you don't need a heavy fur coat, to live in that water. Water uptake is an issue. On the land, water loss is an issue. So kidneys are very efficient at recycling water. But offshore, if you're living in a lake, water uptake is an issue. Your body fluids are more concentrated with ions and materials than the water itself. So water is always trying to enter your body. So animals will have an impermeable skin, perhaps, and they'll produce a very dilute urine. And that interacts, though, with the issue of getting oxygen. Neil mentioned last week that the water has 10 milligrams per liter of oxygen roughly in the spring. That's 10 parts of oxygen per million parts of water, 10 parts per million. So there's 20,000 times less oxygen in the water than in the air, where the air is 20% oxygen. So getting oxygen to fuel metabolism is an issue. And as Gord mentioned, the plants tend to be tiny and mobile. It's mainly phytoplankton to take they can't root like they can in the littoral zone or on land and stand proud and tall. Gord also mentioned that there are few places to hide, and that's a real problem for animals. But as Neil mentioned last week, there are many vertical gradients of light and temperature and oxygen. So while there isn't the spatial heterogeneity that Gord talked about on shore, there are gradients that animals can take advantage of, and plants. And Bob Mars put together a short video introducing you to the thousands of
I've always wondered
animals
what's
that
really
live
in lake
offshore.
water, haven't you? Well, today we're going to find out. We start with meter-long fish, the giants we can see with our naked eyes. Shrink down to decimeter-sized minnows, still visible but getting smaller. Zoom in more, and centimeter-scale creatures like larval Chaoborus and Bythotrophes appear. The invertebrate predators. Keep going, and suddenly we're in a world of millimeter-sized Daphnia and copepods. At a tenth of a millimeter, rotifers, Caratella, and Asplanchna. Phytoplankton dominate at micrometers, the tiny plants that feed this entire world, while bacteria reign supreme at several micrometers, invisible armies everywhere. And at the nanometer scale, viruses invisible to even the most powerful light microscopes. The biodiversity in our lakes is a marvel to behold, with every species and every creature having a unique impact upon the health and sustainability of our lakes. I've always wondered what's really
Thank you, Bob, for putting together that video. So, let's say you've turned your canoe offshore and you've headed out into the limnetic zone, the open water. You want to go for a swim. You jump off the side of the boat, and the first thing you get is a mouthful of water. About 15 mils of water, typically. What are you actually imbibing from that lake? Well, roughly 1.6 billion living things if you consider viruses alive, and they range in scale by a million-fold. There's about 1.5 billion viruses, about 150 million bacteria, about 15 million algae, the phytoplankton that Gord and I talked about. And then you get to the actual animals. You'd probably just imbibed about 15 rotifers. These are the tiniest multicellular actual animals. And then you probably have taken in a little crustacean zooplankton, a little water flea, the Daphnia that I'm about to expose you to. Probably you won't have taken in any of the bigger invertebrate predators. Maybe every 10th or 20th mouthful you will. And if you're extremely unlucky, you might take in a fish, but you'd have to swim all year to do that. So there's a huge range of animals and plants out there. How are they all organized? It's actually almost impossible to understand this in detail because there are thousands of species out there. This was one attempt to look at the food web of Lake Superior, done many years ago, going from the nearshore area that Gord talked about, offshore to the limnetic or the pelagic zone, but also looking at the bottom. And what I want to point out is there's only about 36 circles, each representing a group of life on this graph, but there's a lot more than 36 lines connecting them. Studies indicate that each creature in a lake tends to be directly connected in some way to 10 to 20 other creatures. And so given that in reality, there's probably 1,000 or more species in a lake, there's tens of thousands of actual connections. Well, I can't review them all. So here's kind of a simple approach. At the bottom of the food web, there are algae, hundreds of kinds at any one time in a lake, all of which are, as Gord mentioned, fixing light and turning light into sugar using their green and other pigments. One level above that are the animal plankton that I'm going to talk about, the rotifers, the copepods, and then the water fleas or Daphnia. Between all three groups, there might be 50 to 100 species, and they are fed on, one level up, by small predators like small fish, baby bass, minnows, etc. and also by a dozen or so very intriguing, kind of centimeter long invertebrate predators. This one is a cartoon of the only nice mosquito, a non-biting mosquito called the phantom midge or the glass worm because it's transparent, and they're fed on by the larger fish. Well, those are the links. To actually sort out how the energy flows takes years of work. And here's just one example from a little lake in Halliburton. We're at the border of Halliburton and Muskoka called Mouse Lake on the Frost Center property, where Don McQueen from York University, along with his students and staff from the Ministry of the Environment, including me, spent 3 years documenting the energy flow up to fish from algae in this little tiny lake, less than 10 hectares. And the size of the arrow head indicates the energy flow. So algae were fed on by the little water fleas. They're called Cladastra. Here's a water flea, a Daphnia. Most of that energy went to small fish up here, small fish, but some of it also went to these phantom midges, Chaabris. But it's a small lake, so the near shore, the benthos that Gord was talking about, getting a lot of energy autochthonously, but also allochthenously from maple leaves falling in the fall. That energy went mainly to small fish and then to bigger fish. And the bigger the lake, by the way, the small fish occasionally, there was one day where a bass ate a squirrel. That was, so there's some terrestrial energy in surprising ways that also makes it out to the fish. The bigger the lake is, arguably the less important, certainly the direct terrestrial input will be. So it's complicated, but now I'd like to turn my attention to the water fleas. Here's a little water flea called Daphnia. Talk is called for the love of water fleas or Daphnia. She is a she, first of all. She's got 4 babies in the brood pouch on her back. Those are the baby's eyes. She's 1 millimeter long. This is her head. This is her eye. This is kind of her tail end. She's got a 2-sided shell that's open to the water along here. And these are filtering combs and a crushing mandible that I'll talk about in a few minutes. I'd like to talk about how she deals with the challenges that I talked about earlier of living in the open water. So she's an animal. She's only 1 millimeter long. She's like a little tiny smushed up crayfish with her tail of the crayfish bent up into the shell. But she has an eye that sees better than we do. She swims really well. She has a brain. About a half of the whole area of her body is devoted to food gathering. She can't sit on the leaf of a lily pad. She has to find tiny mobile plants and feed on them. She has a wonderful little heart that beats about 200 times a minute. And she has, in this case, 3 babies on her back in a brood pouch. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about how splendid and different these little animals are. First of all, she has a much more interesting sex life than most mammals. All summer, here's a mother water flea, a Daphnia. She produces only daughters parthenogenically, small clones of herself. And so every week she'll go through a cycle of having little eggs that turn into little daughters that are replicas of herself until October and November, when a wise mother, Daphnia, realizes the water's getting cold, the days are getting short, the food is getting scarce. winter is on the horizon, time for a change. So she induces a change in her daughter so that some of her daughter's offspring will be male. So suddenly there are males and females, and they mate in the fall to produce an egg by sex, and that egg sinks to the bottom of the lake and settles in the sediments and then hatches in the spring. All of those eggs will hatch as girls to reproduce this cycle. This pattern of a wise grandmother, Daphnia, making a decision that some of her grandchildren should be male, inspired local artist Linda Lynn to paint something she called the Daphnia's Prom Party, where here Linda tells me all grandmothers are lavender in color. So here's a grandmother, Daphnia, sending off one of her grandchildren to meet the girls at the prom. Now, these eggs that are produced in the fall that sink to the bottom and overwinter, most of them hatch in the spring, but some of them get buried in the sediments and can live for up to 700 years. So this has fueled a whole discipline of zooplankton ecology with the wonderful name of resurrection ecology. You can take a core of lake sediments, you can slice it, you can date the sediments, you can extract the little eggs, you can put them in the light and hatch them out and actually study the behavior and the characteristics of water fleas that lived in our lakes before European colonization. This technique of resurrection ecology has been used to study evolution of water fleas. That's an aside, but it's kind of a neat aside. So how do these little water fleas deal with the challenges of living offshore? How do they find mobile, patchy, single-celled plants, the algae, that are themselves moving up and down in the water column? Well, it starts with having a remarkable eye. So here's the eye of a water flea seen from the bottom. This is looking at the ventral surface of the animal. They see in some ways better than us. The top of the eye has photopigments that see in the ultraviolet. We can't do that. And so they avoid the top of the water where ultraviolet may kill them in their transparent bodies. The rest of the eye, like a fruit fly or a wasp or a housefly, is covered with ommatidia. Not very many. They only have 22 in total. But that's enough for them to do what they have to do. What the water fleas do is they point the long axis of their body at the brightest patch of their visual field, which is where the sun would be. And over the course of the day, they keep their body pointed at the sun, and then they measure the light around their eye that's scattered, and they swim up and down until they find a scattering layer, and a light scattering layer means there's algae. And then in their brains, this is an animal that's a millimeter long, but they have a brain, and they're great mathematicians. They have in their brain a regression equation that predicts the amount of algae in the water from the scattering distribution of light, and they adjust the beating rate of their legs to maximize the uptake of water based on how scattered the light field is. Pretty sophisticated. So here now is looking at a Daphnia from the side, and I'm going to point out that a huge fraction of the body, cross-sectional area, about 60%, is occupied by this feeding chamber. It's open to the water on the bottom. And in this feeding chamber are 5 pairs of specialized legs or limbs that are like the most sophisticated furnace filters you've ever seen. The first couple create a feeding current, And then they have a coarse filter that gets rid of stuff that's too hard to eat. And then they have a phytoplankton collecting screen, and they have a bacteria particle size collecting screen, and then they have a scraper on their fifth leg that moves the algae up to their midline where it's brought forward to their mandible by cilia. But there's a problem. The algae have been dealing with being eaten by animal plankton for millions of years, and there's been kind of a race between predator and prey. So the most nutritious algae are the diatoms, like this diatom, and another group called the golden yellow algae, and they live in glass shells. Well, it would be like your mother inviting you to the dining room table, and on the menu first is a salad, but the only way to get the salad is to eat your way through the glass bowl. The water fleas have to crunch the glass in the diatoms to get at the algal cell within. So how do they do that? And remember, this is in an animal that is 1 millimeter long. They have tearing teeth that you see here. They have crushing plates that smash those little glass salad bowls containing the algae that they've collected off these amazing filtering sieves. Then they have a muscular esophagus. And this is actually glands that produce secretions that digest the algae. So this little tiny animal that's 1 millimeter long creates a constant rain of crushed glass out of its open carapace to the bottoms of lakes. The diatomaceous earth that you can get to put in your gardens is a product of the crushing action of billions of Daphnia over millennia, Daphnia and all of her cousins. The result of all that is that the water fleas, the zooplankton, can control the mass of algae that are in a lake, typically in the summer. If you look at what controls algal biomass in a nutrient-poor lake, a so-called oligotrophic lake, it's physics in the spring and fall, but in the summer, it's grazing and just the amount of nutrients available to the algae. The Daphnia are also multitaskers. So those first two legs that pump the water have three functions. First of all, they pump the water in. It actually comes in here at the bottom of the feeding chamber, but it also comes in behind their gut into their brood chamber on their back. So they use that to ventilate their eggs. They're good mothers. They pump water over their eggs, and then there are two pores around the gut, and it comes out this way. So there's a constant flow of water over their eggs, ventilating their eggs as good mothers should. And the more eggs they have, and the closer they are to being released, as little tiny Daphnia, the more water they pump to make sure their babies stay healthy. The third thing they do, which I forgot to mention, these eggs, is they act as gills, these filtering legs. Remember, there's 20,000 times less oxygen in the water than there is in air, and so those really fine screens act as gills. That's their third function. So, but let's delve a little more deeply into the challenges of living in the open water. As Gord said, there's no place to hide. So trick number one, if you're going to be dead rather than fed, is to be transparent. Many of the small animals that live offshore are transparent, but you have to have a black eye if you're going to absorb light. And as you feed, your stomach becomes visible. So you can't really hide completely from small fish that might eat you. So what do you do? Well, one thing you might do is take advantage of the gradients that Neil mentioned last week. You can migrate down into darker waters during the day. Many of you that are lake stewards may have used this device called the Secchi disc to measure water clarity. You lower it into the water. When it disappears, that's a measure of what's called the Secchi disc depth. It's a measure of water clarity. And Stan Dodson years ago realized that the water fleas migrated in a way that was proportional to how clear the water was. The clearer the water was, the deeper the animals had to migrate to protect themselves from being eaten by fish during the day. There were 3 lakes that didn't fit the pattern, and those lakes had, turns out, a small number of fish that would eat the water fleas. So we learned something else. The water fleas actually are aware of how vulnerable they are to planktivorous fish. And this author spent decades trying to figure out why. And it turns out they can taste fish chemicals in the water. But there's an enormous energetic cost to this swimming. Now, in a typical day, I try and walk for an hour. That's about 2,000 of my body lengths. And I have air that's 100 times less viscous than water, and I have earth that I can push against in my migration, in my daily walks. The Daphnia are marathon swimmers in these Clearwater lakes. They'll swim 10 meters, that's 20,000 body lengths in a day, and they're doing that in water that's really viscous. So they really have to want to avoid being eaten for them to undergo these daily marathon swims. Now, there's another problem, and that's that not all the predators of the little water fleas are visual predators that hunt during the day. Here's a wonderful photomicrograph of that larva of that little phantom midge or that glass worm. They're about a centimeter long, and so they're potentially quite visible to fish, although they are also transparent. So they avoid fish by only coming out at night. They swim off the bottom at night into the water column. They're ambush predators. They hang out in the water column. They're 10 to 20 times bigger than the water fleas that they eat. They lash out and grab them with this part of their head assembly, and that's their crushing mandible that can tear the little water fleas apart. But this happens at night when there's no light. So they're not visual predators. They hunt by detecting pressure waves in the water, and they detect those waves using all these spines. Well, so being transparent won't help, swimming down won't help. So what the water fleas do is they are shapeshifters. So these 8 pictures of a Daphnia, different Daphnia types, the image on the left of each pair is the normal appearance. The image on the right is the shape they shift into to avoid being eaten by a particular predator. When they end up looking like a clansman here, it changes their pressure wave as they swim through the water so that the phantom midge misses them. This type that we have in our lakes forms teeth on its neck so that the phantom midge can grab it, but it gets stuck in its mouth and they spit it out. This amazing crest is formed to try and deal with water boatmen. And here is a Daphnia desperately trying to be too big for a small fish to eat. Well, I've introduced you, I hope, to a marvelous little animal in the lakes called Daphnia. There is about 200 species of Daphnia around the world and thousands of scientific articles on Daphnia. I've told you a few things that I find amazing. They're good mothers. They ventilate their offspring. They choose the gender of their grandchildren, producing males in the fall that'll overwinter. They're multitaskers. Their feeding appendages gather food, take up oxygen, and create feeding currents to look after their young. The eggs that can settle to the bottom of lakes can be buried and live for 700 years. So they kind of can be as long-lived as the oldest white pine in our mature forests in Temagami. They're marathon swimmers, swimming 20,000 body lengths a day. They're shapeshifters, adjusting their shape when and if they taste particular predators in the water. I didn't mention these are their swimming antennae with all these little hairs that allow them to paddle through the water. And if some predator manages to rip off a limb, they can grow it back. They see in a way better than us because they can see into the ultraviolet, they can chew their way through glass, and they can eat up to half of all the algae in a lake every day. Although on average, as Lenore said, they typically process all the phytoplankton offshore in a lake every week or so. So they're keeping our lakes clean and they're feeding the fish. They are, in my mind, worth protecting, and there are threats. So I invite you to tune in next week to our final set of 2 webinars where we'll hear from Dr. Andrew Patterson about the threats to our lakes, and we'll be educated by Elder Christopher Stock in ways in which our First Nations peoples view their interaction with our lakes. I thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing. And I'll turn the conversation, and now Gord and I are open to questions. I hope I've shared a little bit of why I happen to find water fleas fascinating animals. I know Gord finds aquatic macrophytes equally fascinating plants.
Much more fascinating.
Much more fascinating. The one thing I didn't say is that these are absolutely not isolated ecosystems. Under the influence of the wind, water moves typically in Muskoka about 1 kilometer a day, and so it's interacting with the near shore on a regular basis. The open waters are not isolated from the near shore at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Norman and Gord. I'm Wendy Fairburn. I'm the GM of the Muskoka Discovery Center. We are looking for questions now. So if you want to take a few seconds and put something in the question box and vote for it, we'll give you a few minutes before we start having Norman and Gordon answer questions here. So I'll give you, I would do the doon, 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 but my singing is terrible. So
While you're waiting, Wendy, Gord, did you want to add anything to what I said?
No, it seems that we thought they, they matched each other pretty well.
Okay.
When I peeked at the questions, I saw one that I can answer.
well, why don't you go ahead and answer that one, Gord? Then, if you're looking at them, please do that. Which one is it?
This is swale. Can we create lake trout habitat along the shoreline? We have about 80 feet of shoreline, and the shallow it's about 10 feet. We use the area to maintain habitat. How can we enhance it? And the answer is yes, you can. I would get some assistance from because I've worked with a crew that's done that. You have to get a lake trout biologist basically, because the lake trout are very picky about the size and nature of the coarse rock material. We spend a lot of time getting the right sort of size and complexity of it, and with broken rock, and we use it to expand some existing spawning beds, and it worked because the trout came in a subsequent year. So you could create a shoal. I warn you though, putting rocks in the water and creating shoals has implications for perhaps for your neighbors, and it depends on the shoreline. But you really need advice from a lake trout a fisheries biologist that has experience with lake trout, that knows the kind of coarse rock that they like. But you can, in fact, create a show. And I, in some cases, I think it's a really good idea, because the often what limits the amount of trout in a body of water is there a spawning area that's available.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let's go with the next question here. Going up and down here. Could you provide some resources for, and I'm terrible with words, so isoetzmeches. So the spelling, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Ooh, gee, Norm, do you think Wetzel talks about isoetzmeches or isoedes?
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. Yeah, maybe
terminology textbook, I think, somewhere like that. I mean, I did my master's degree on this stuff, so I'm a little too, in some respect, too close to it. But and I'm certainly there are. I don't want to cite too many technical things, but you know, it's interesting because it's a common form of plant community that occurs in these oligotrophic lakes in like Muskoka, common here, but rare around the world. Like most people have not encountered them and don't know what they are. That's why I pointed them out. But around to people who grew up in Muskoka and Halliburton, they'd say, "Oh yeah, we've seen those." But boy, you don't see them elsewhere. But it's Isoedes is the species, but there's also a range of other, about 4 or 5 other species that are in these mats. And they have this characteristic, and it has to do with, I don't want to get too technical on here, but it has to do with the low carbonate concentrations. And the only way they can get enough carbon is the bigger plants like this are starved in those lakes, and they need these dense little zones of material where the carbon is being cycled by the creatures and various things. You find something, Norm?
Yeah, chapter 24 in Wetzel's limnology is on macrophytes, and it'll probably be in there.
Okay, Wetzel is one of the famous limnologists, and I won't say the seminal work, but pretty damn close to the seminal work, because it's some other books that are, but his name's Robert Wetzel, just Wetzel, and you probably find something on the internet.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We've got someone wondering, they've heard that putting leaves should be dumped into the lake from the whole property because the deterioration uses oxygen in the lakes. Is it a good thing or a bad thing?
If you have a wild littoral zone portion, you can add the leaves and it's fine, and they'll chew them up and that'd be no problem. I wouldn't put them in the swimming area or the area because they become a nuisance. But the lake is fully capable of consuming those leaves, especially if you get sort of a calmer area with aquatic plants and things. They'll just consume it, no problem. All these little insect larvae, all the shredders and chewers, and tear it all to bits, and then the smaller creatures and bacteria go after them as well. So yeah, you could you can do that as long as you keep it to those zones that are fairly natural. I wouldn't put them in an open air because they'll become a nuisance otherwise.
Thank you.
In fact, I'll just add that all those insects larvae are so used to dealing with leaves that one standard method of assessing the health of a littoral zone is to use packs of leaves. They're called leaf packs, and you just put them out there, and then you come back in a week and you pull them in, and you get hundreds and hundreds of shredders and chewers, in the leaf pack.
I know all the goody, all the little creatures that have come in and utilize them.
Perfect. Thank you. Gord, you said docks can sometimes add useful structure.
Yes.
What design choices make a dock more habitat friendly or less harmful to the area?
The kind of docks, okay, docks that provide shade and they provide structure and surface area. So if you have one of the old docks built with stones in the cribbing, that has one kind of, the newer docks will just have steel poles going down. It just provides shade. There's not a whole lot in those docks, but shade to shade, and things work under the shade. But the old cribbing docks actually provide, more habitat because they got a lot of invertebrates in them as well. If you got time for a small story, I have a dock and a boathouse in Temagami, where my cottage is. And I had a neighbor. He's passed on now, but his name was Bob. He had a bit of sense of humor. And I've got this green boathouse, and it's the only boathouse on that whole shore of that lake. And he said people, because Bob lived on the lake, basically almost grew up there most of his life, and lived on the lake. And people used to ask Bob, where's the best place to go fishing? He said, "Oh, well, it's clearly the green boathouse." So he used to just to bug me, and all these people would come over. One day, I remember I had to pull the hooks off out of my dock from 3 different fishermen who were casting towards the green boathouse and hooked into my dock. So it is true, though. The bass are hanging out under my dock and in my boathouse.
Okay, next question. Which are the worst pollutants in the Muskoka lakes?
Whoa.
That's a lot of heavy answers, right?
Want to start that, Gordon? Well, historically, it used to be simpler things like phosphorus and acid. And then there was also a time when it was arsenate and DDT were added as insecticides around the lakes about 100 years ago, arsenate, and in the 50s, 60s, or in the 70s, DDT stopped then. And after that, it really would have been nutrients from sewage and then acid.
In the worst place was in Lake Muskoka was the Gravenhurst Bay. Gravenhurst Bay was very problematic. It was sewage related, and to some degree, stormwater, but mostly sewage related. And they built a new plant in the 80s, mid 80s, and they cleared that up. So Gravenhurst Bay is much better today than it was. So, but there's spots where sewage was coming in that historically were problematic. And there probably were, before we measured such things, some of the lumbering, when they used to float logs and the bark would come off, some of the bays would be full of bark on the bottom, and that was problematic in those particular areas, but it just clears up with time.
Yeah. And there still is a mercury issue in the fish and Muskoka lakes, and sadly that will take a very long time to kind of self-correct, because mercury takes a long time to work its way through ecosystems. The good thing, and actually Gord will know this better than me, is we have dramatically reduced the use of mercury in paints and in veterinary medicine.
The lakes, Norm, it came from coal burning.
Yeah, but most of it came from coal burning. Gord's certainly right there, and we don't. So, but these days, I have to say, what I worry about is small amounts of a vast number of different contaminants, pharmaceuticals.
The organization is road salt.
Yeah, and then, thank you. So the 2 things Friends of the Muskoka Watershed is working on. One is too little of something, too little calcium, and the other is too much of something, too much road salt. And our lakes are particularly vulnerable to the toxic effects of road salt because they're soft water and nutrient poor. So chloride levels roughly 10 times lower than the Canadian Water Quality Guideline are more than likely toxic in our lakes.
Interesting, you hear Norm and I talk, and Neil, soft water, nutrient poor, oligotrophic lakes, to the lake public, they're really clean.
Yeah,
we know that, and we tend to talk about the limnological importance of them, but we know that they're ultra clean. And Muskoka lakes are unique and vast. If you look at what's around the world, there are areas like this.
And Canada is actually quite lucky. We have the largest area in the world that's more than 10% surface water. So I think we have a unique responsibility on the Canadian Shield to look after our water, because there isn't much else like this in the world. Parts of Scandinavia, parts of the coast of Chile, might have the same amount of fresh water, but we have an we're blessed, with the amount of clean, fresh water that we have.
If you don't mind a diversion too, you're absolutely right. And of course, the other thing is like lakes that have viable lake trout populations. There's only a few in the world, and we have many of them, most of them, I guess. And
Yeah.
And we've lost when you lose a lake trout when you lose a lake trout, and they're gone. They don't come back. You can't restock lake trout effectively. You can't get them to reproduce. If you lose the native populations, you end up, they use splake to create a fishery and things. That's not the same as a lake trout population.
This summer, we had record low levels in some of our lakes. How might this affect the littoral zone?
Well, it wasn't a problem, I don't think, anywhere. I mean, the one thing about the littoral is because it's sensitive to water levels and fluctuates tremendously, it is resilient in that respect, right? So you have if they go to low levels, and the next year it's a high level, you'll find it comes back pretty much identically, as long as it moves in, say, the 10-year cycle or something like that. If you get strange things happening and the lake drying out tremendously and dropping to tremendous levels, then you can kill off you'll get the land plants will increase. Incidentally, by the way, it's just how the cottage lake I grew up on, my dad's cottage went down. My brother owns the place there, and it's an oligotrophic lake in Alaska up in Earthroot Falls, Nelly Lake it's called, and we spent a lifetime there, my brother and I. So we've seen. I'm 72, he's 75, many years in cycles. And just in the last few years, all of a sudden the lake dropped and the littoral zone dropped up. And they found out it was as a result of some ditching activity, of forestry activity in the north end of the lake, which they have now remediated. But it did cause that kind of problem where the land plants just invade the littoral zone, and the littoral zone is temporarily destroyed.
I will comment that our lakes naturally change elevation naturally. And actually, with the amount of damming that's gone on in Muskoka, there's actually less fluctuation in lake levels now interannually than there would have been historically before the lakes were dammed.
That's true. Yeah. And that's widespread.
Yeah.
You referenced the Lake Partner Program with the Sishi measurements. What are other parameters beyond the routine list in the spring sampling program that would be valuable to measure and document for within our lakes?
Okay. So right now the lake, there are two programs that I'll quickly mention. The Ministry of the Environment runs the Lake Partner Program out of the Dorset Environmental Science Center that measures, I'm going to say about a dozen or more parameters. And then the Muskoka Lakes Association has their own program that measures historically phosphorus, but also water clarity, bacteria, and more recently also calcium and chloride, I believe. And the district water quality program samples about 160 lakes every couple of years, and they report mainly phosphorus, but they also measure several other parameters which you can get from them. So you're measuring historical issues with phosphorus, and so the newest parameters that people have added are calcium and chloride. Those are worth adding because those are both existing problems. And I think it's also perhaps worth mentioning, it's absolutely worth mentioning or measuring lake transparency with Secundisc. And the other thing that's varying a lot is organic carbon. And that's neither good nor bad, but there have been changes in water color and in the organic carbon content of lakes. And that's another master variable like acidity. So that's probably worth measuring. Gord, what do you think? Would you add?
I think that the changes in their ability to measure now, Norm, from the days when we used to do it, like for instance, measuring oxygen was really tough in the old days. You had to be very
Yeah.
with the membranes and the whole. Uh, but hypolimnetic oxygen levels are really important and are under threat. So what does that mean? Well, Neil probably talked about the levels in the lakes. You have the epilimnion, the upper layer, which is active and mixing
Yeah.
here. The thermocline, a zone of rapidly changing temperature, and that basically puts a lid on things. And below that is a dark, cold layer that in the middle of summer does not mix with the surface. And the oxygen levels in that are really important to fish like lake trout. So hypolimnetic oxygen. Now, the Ministry of Environment can go out, it was a big deal to go measure it, or the Ministry of Natural Resources. But I know that there are much better sensors now, I believe. Norm, you probably know more sensors than I do. And I think if we could expand the cottage program, so yes, do spring phosphorus, yes, do the samples, yes, do SECI, yes, do these traditional things to keep consistent databases. But if we could add, if we had the equipment, or people could acquire the equipment and add hypolimnetic oxygen, that would be very valuable in terms of.
Yeah. And I know there are lakes, so you can, that's still expensive equipment, but you can rent it. And so it's possible to rent those oxygen probes for a couple of days and actually generate that data, and that would be useful.
That's something you would do in August.
Yeah.
Late August. So not the other samples are often the water samples you have to do in the early spring, but in late August, that's the time you want to do hypolimnetic oxygen.
Okay, for the lakes with low calcium levels, would sterilized oyster shells used by chicken farmers and suspended in a small burlap bags under the docks be beneficial?
So as if the goal is to provide a local source, like an immediately local source of calcium that might dissolve off those shells into the water, maybe it would be some use in that immediate little local area, but not for the whole lake, and not for the whole littoral zone, I wouldn't think. So, do chicken farmers feed oyster shells to their chickens? I didn't know that. That makes a lot of sense, actually.
And they make shells because of the egg shells.
Now, this is always an interest this time of year specifically. Can you speak to the impact of road salt on maintaining the health of our lakes?
Oh, there you go. That one's for you, Norm.
Okay. Oh, you want me to take that? Okay. Okay, Friends of the Muskoka Watershed identifies issues that are severe and widespread and currently mismanaged that the public can help with. Road salt is the second such widespread severe issue that we identified. 10 milligrams per liter of chloride or more is toxic in soft water nutrient poor lakes. Pardon?
You should explain salt is sodium chloride. So you put
salt is sodium chloride. The sodium part is of concern to human health. The chloride part is more of concern to lake health. And chloride levels in Muskoka lakes that are well developed have risen dramatically. For example, in Gravenhurst Bay, Muskoka Bay, of Lake Muskoka, that Gord mentioned earlier, chloride levels have increased from about half a milligram per liter to about 16. So they're up over 30-fold over the last 40 years to a level that's now somewhat dangerous. There's 30,000 tons of road salt entering Lake Muskoka every year. That's the equivalent of a line of salt trucks from Bracebridge through Port Carling, bumper to bumper. And a lot of people are aware of this. Municipalities are doing what they can. We have to keep people safe. But our mission is to try and get people to not use more salt than is actually needed on their driveways and parking lots. I think we've all seen piles of salt sitting on sidewalks in plazas or at gas pumps, in parking lots. If there's piles of salt sitting there on dry pavement, sweep it up and use it again. That is excessive use of salt, and that is actually damaging our lakes. And it's the big developed lakes, not so much like lakes like in Algonquin Park. Fluoride levels have actually fallen because the atmosphere is cleaner, than it was 50 years ago. But but where we are developing and adding salt, um, it's an issue that Friends of Muskoka Watershed and many municipalities are actually concerned about. Anything to add, Gord, or?
No, I think it's I mean, other than the known toxicity now, it's the only thing you didn't
Yeah.
mention. But,
10 milligrams per liter in soft water is toxic.
right, and people don't realize that the standards are set in hard water just because
Yeah.
so few soft water lakes. They set the standards in hard water, which is when the creatures in high water are a lot more tolerant to salt.
Yeah.
So the impact is greatest in places like Muskoka. Yep.
Just following up on that, can Norm provide a link reference contact? So we'll just, if the Lake Association would like to participate in road salt monitoring program, just send them off to the Friends of the Watershed. Norm, is that the best place to go
Yeah.
to?
Yeah, or Alicia, Alesha at fotmw.org. So
Perfect.
Alicia is running our Salty Muskoka project.
I think there's an answer going up in the question space there. I'd like to take the time now to ask you guys if there's any last words you want to say. If we haven't gotten to your question, we will hopefully be able to answer it somewhere. Send it off to us through info@realmuskoka.com. And Norm, Gord, do you have two sentences to say for the end of the webinar here?
Well, be aware of the littoral. You live on the edge of the lake. The littoral is essential to the functioning of the greater lake, and it's in your hands. You impact that directly. You don't impact out in the middle of the lake so much, but you do in the littoral.
Yeah. And if you want to know how we're affecting the middle of the lake, sign in to the webinars next week.
Perfect. Well, we hope to see everyone next week. And thank you very much, Gordon and Norm, for this wonderful opportunity to learn a little bit more about lakes. Everyone, see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye all. Thank you.